Hey everyone, welcome back to the Best of Toronto Living. Today I'm going to talk about how to cancel your lease agreement in the proper way. We're going to discuss your rights and responsibilities, how to avoid legal trouble, and the particular steps you need to take to cancel that lease so you're able to move on. With that, let's dive in. When you sign a lease, you are signing a legally binding contract between you, the tenant, and the landlord. As such, these legally binding contracts are governed by law. And in Canada, they're governed by provincial and territorial regulations. So every province has its own set of rules as to how these lease agreements can be governed. Now, you can write something in the agreement, but if it contradicts the rules of the province or territory you're in, it's invalid. So it's really important to understand these rules and regulations. In Ontario, where I practice as a realtor here in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto Area, it's known as the Residential Tenancies Act in Ontario. And there's a landlord and tenant board that tenants and landlords can consult if they have questions about those rules. These rules and regulations are a good thing. Think about it. As a tenant, when you signed your lease agreement and you moved into the home you're in now, isn't it a good thing that the landlord cannot knock on your door one day and say, look, I know I signed that piece of paper, but I've changed my mind. I want you to leave tomorrow. The landlord cannot do that. And as a landlord cannot do that, you as the tenant can't do that as well. You can't just phone up the landlord and say, I'm going to leave tomorrow. Bye-bye. No. And sometimes the type of lease you're in can create some confusion. Maybe you're on a month-to-month lease, which renews month to month. Or you're on a fixed-term lease, typically a one-year lease, and you're approaching the end of that one-year term, and now you think you can just walk away. But that's not how it works. You've got to give notice. And typically it's 60 days notice, irrespective of whether you're in a month-to-month or a fixed-term, at least in Ontario, that's the case. And like I said earlier, you've got to consult the provincial regulations that govern your province or territory. So you've got to look into those rules and regulations. What happens if you cancel your lease without following the legal steps? There are consequences, serious consequences. The landlord could take legal action against you, and you're likely going to lose, which means you're going to owe the landlord every month of rent that you did not pay properly. Also, you're most likely going to lose your last month's rent deposit, a security deposit. There may be fines for damages in court. So it's really not worth it. Do it the right way. There are essentially three legal ways to end a lease. The first is to give notice the proper way, which is typically 60 days notice. Again, you have to consult the rules and regulations within your province or territory. Second way that you can legally end the lease is that if you and the landlord can come to some mutual agreement. This could be, at least in Ontario, is an N11 form that's typically signed. And that's when landlord and tenant agree on a date. The landlord may ask for a penalty. Typically 1 month penalty is common, but it's really negotiable between you and your landlord. The other legal way of ending a lease is that you typically have an option for finding subletting, essentially finding another tenant to replace you for the rest of the term, especially if you're not fulfilling the term correctly. So in that case, it's really up to the landlord's discretion to approve a tenant. If you recommend a tenant to sublet, they still have to follow all the steps in applying just like you did, provide all the documentation, and the landlord needs to know that they are a good fit, that they can pay the rent, and all their references check out. So ultimately, the landlord will make the final decision, but typically they can't object to that option. So it's definitely an option to legally end your lease. These are the steps that I recommend to help you cancel your lease agreement in the proper way. First, study your lease agreement. Check for any penalties or early termination clauses. Secondly, talk to the provincial body that governs and oversees residential tenancy agreements in your province. In Ontario, it's the Landlord and Tenant Board. And the law is the Residential Tenancies Act of Ontario. So consult them. Give them a call. They will walk you through your options. If you have any questions, they're there to help. Also, of course, it's important to talk to the landlord. Have a heart-to-heart conversation. Tell them what you're going through. Tell them the situation you're in. Talk it through. They may be open to negotiating an early termination if that's what you're looking for. Fourthly, I strongly recommend you, again, consult the provincial website that governs the lease agreements, or give them a call to understand what proper notice you need to give. It's not enough to just leave a text message or an email or a voice message. You've got to fill in the proper forms, and that's for your protection as well as the landlord's protection. It's for the mutual benefit of you both. And lastly, I recommend to keep a record of all correspondence between you and the landlord. Hopefully it won't come to that. Usually everything can be resolved through good communication. Yet if there is a dispute, it's good to have that paper trail in place. Since I'm from Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area, as a real estate agent, I'm dealing with the Ontario Residential Tenancies Act day in and day out, helping clients like yourself. If you are planning to end a lease here in Ontario, you have to give a minimum of 60 days notice. And if your lease agreement starts on the 1st, which many leases do, that means 60 days notice before the 1st. So let's say it's April 22nd. I'm just pulling out a date, April 22nd. And you've decided that you want to end your lease the proper way. If you give notice before the end of the month, in this case, April 22nd, so before the end of April, you are legally obligated to stay for 2 months because your lease starts from the 1st. You've got to pay for the last 2 months, which would be May and June. So you can leave on the end of June. Okay? So it really depends on when your lease agreement begins. That's where you have to give 60 days notice before that specific date. If you have any questions about that, of course you can reach out to me through the channel. Now, if you are in a 1-year lease that's now become a month-to-month lease, or you're in your first year and you want to give that proper notice, you've got to fill out in Ontario what's called an N9. And that form allows you, all you have to do is fill that out and submit it to the owner or the landlord. And once you do, you have given legal notice, official notice, to end that tenancy. Now, if you're in the middle of the lease agreement or the middle of the year term that you've signed, you have to negotiate with the landlord and come to some mutual agreement. And if you do, then you've got to sign the N11 Form, where you mutually both sign that form agreeing to end the lease early. And like I said, there may be a penalty that the landlord may demand for that privilege. And it is a privilege, okay? And it's typically because the landlord has to incur all these extra costs now to find another tenant. So those are your options here in Ontario. And of course, you could explore that subletting option. And usually the landlords are agreeable to that. Try to find a tenant to replace you to sublet the property. But the landlord has to agree to that tenant. That tenant has to be suitable, have the right documentation, good credit, good income to afford the place and qualify, and it's up to the landlord's discretion. Well, that concludes today's episode. I hope you enjoyed as much as I have. If you're looking for more content like this, subscribe, hit that bell notification. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, DM me. You can book a Zoom chat with me directly. All the info is here on the channel. Thanks for dropping by. I look forward to seeing you the next time.